Welcome to this introduction to lipids, that's fats and oils, in food. Fats and oils are used by our bodies for energy, building material, and communication. Fat has gotten some bad press over the last few decades, but getting enough of the right fats is essential for everything from our brain to how our immune system functions. What fats we eat help determine how easily our blood flows and clots, for example. We even need fat to help us absorb some of the vitamins in our food, notably the fat-soluble vitamins. Animals and plants also use fats and oils for energy, structure, communication, so most foods contain some fat or oil. Foods like olive oil and clarified butter are almost exclusively made of oil or fat, whereas other foods such as cheese, nuts, meat, fish, poultry, and eggs contain some fats and oils along with protein, often carbohydrates, and of course micronutrients. Because fats and oils of the right kind and in the right quantities are essentials to good health, knowing a little bit about them is important. If you get a little lost in the details, rest assured we'll be bringing it all together at the end. First things first, sometimes when scientists talk about fats and oils, they use the word lipid because the word lipid covers all kinds of fats and oils. You may have heard your doctor talk about your blood lipids or blood lipid profile. If so, they were referring to the different fats and oils in your blood, such as cholesterol and triglycerides. When a lipid is solid at normal room temperature, we call it a fat, and when it's liquid at normal room temperature, we call it an oil. We need to look at a little bit of chemistry for the rest of this module to make sense. Chemically, fats consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The basic unit of fat is the fatty acid, and the basic unit of that is carbon, joined to another carbon and some hydrogens. Fatty acids vary in how many carbons are linked together, but at the end is a carboxylic acid molecule. The dashes and the equal signs represent bonds between the individual atoms, between carbon and carbon, carbon and hydrogen, carbon and oxygen, or oxygen and hydrogen. Sometimes there are not enough hydrogens to saturate the carbon. In other words, there are not enough hydrogens to attach to the available bonds. So instead of this, we get this, or this. The bond that would be between the carbon and the hydrogen has joined to the next carbon. This gives us the double bond, here shown as an equal sign, and that's common to all unsaturated fats. Some of the carbons will be joined by double bonds. As you can see, there are two forms. The first, with the hydrogens on the same side, is known as the cis form, and the second, with the hydrogens on the opposite sides, is the trans form. The key thing to know is that the arrangement of the hydrogens determines the shape of the fatty acid, and that influences how it behaves in our bodies and what effects it has ultimately on our health and well-being. So just as proteins are made up of smaller units, amino acids, so are lipids. The units lipids are made of are called fatty acids. Different fatty acids have different characteristics that affect how our bodies digest, absorb, and use them. They also differ in terms of how they affect our health. One way we can describe specific fatty acids is chain length. Are they short, medium, long, or very long? And this simply refers to how many carbons make up the length of the fatty acid. As well as length, fatty acids also differ in other areas such as saturation. You'll have probably heard about saturated fats, as they get their own row on the nutrition information panel on food labels. And also, they get a lot of bad press, often unfairly. You may also have heard about monounsaturated fats, maybe in relation to olive oil or avocado oil, or the traditional diets of Mediterranean countries which are rich in monounsaturated fats. You may have heard about polyunsaturated fats in relation to vegetable or fish oils, in which case you've probably come across the terms omega-3 or N3 and omega-6 or N6 fats. You probably won't have heard about omega-9 or N9 fats, but they too are part of the diet. Lastly, you've probably heard about trans fats as something to avoid. Until just now, you may however not have heard of cis fats, but these include all the non-trans polyunsaturated fats, including the two fatty acids essential to human life. Lastly, polyunsaturated fatty acids are also defined by conjugation, being present or absent. Among other things, these different fatty acids are shaped differently, and that means they behave differently. Saturated fats and trans fats don't have the kinks common to most unsaturated fats, for example. Because of some chemistry we won't get into, saturated fats are more stable chemically and less saturated fats are less stable chemically. Saturated fats are less likely to undergo chemical changes while cooking at higher heat, for example. And we'll touch on the importance of that a little bit later. There are numerous fatty acids found in most diets. Here are just some of the more common examples and what categories they fit in. This is not something to remember in detail, only something to be aware of. Now, aside from length and saturation, etc., how fatty acids are joined together also matters. The most common form of fat in food and in your body is as a triglyceride, or sometimes also called a triacylglycerol. Same thing. The second is actually probably the more correct term, but mostly in human physiology you'll hear the term triglyceride. And this simply means three fatty acids, hence the tri part, joined to a glycerol as shown here. The glycerol, hence the glyceride part. Triglyceride. Three fatty acids joined to a glycerol. If you ever come across the term diglyceride, this simply means two fatty acids joined to a glycerol, and a monoglyceride is one fatty acid joined to a glycerol. Our body can break fat down into glycerol and fatty acids, and then build it back up to mono, di, and triglycerides. Cholesterol is another lipid found in our bodies, as well as in animal foods. Although plants have something similar, they don't contain cholesterol. So labeling an oil that comes from seeds, nuts, or some other part of a plant as cholesterol-free is actually a bit pointless and probably intended to mislead you into thinking all cholesterol-free foods are healthy. Cholesterol gets a lot of bad press in relation to coronary heart disease, but our bodies actually use it to help build the wall around our cells. Our brains are naturally high in cholesterol, and our bodies need cholesterol as it's the building block of hormones, particularly sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, and stress hormones like, for example, cortisol. In fact, our bodies make cholesterol, with the cholesterol in our diets often supplying only a small amount of the total that we have in our bodies. Likewise, as the name suggests, phospholipids are another form of lipid, this time with a phosphate attached at one end. Specifically, a phospholipid is made up of two fatty acids, a phosphate group, and a glycerol molecule. If you've ever learnt about anatomy or cell biology, you may remember that our cells are surrounded by a phospholipid membrane or phospholipid bilayer. So while the most common form of lipid in our diet is as a triglyceride, any whole food will contain phospholipids because, plant or animal based, that food will be made up of cells. By now, I hope you've come to the conclusion that fats and oils aren't as simple as you thought. Most minimally processed foods contain a broad variety of fatty acids, much of them in the form of triglycerides, but also cholesterol and other forms. Given this complexity, it's downright irresponsible to make broad, simplistic statements such as fat is bad or that eating fat will make you fat. Even when people talk about a subtype of fat such as saturated fat, the claims are often oversimplified and inaccurate. The key message here is that lipids vary hugely in their chemical structure and therefore their effect on health. Simple labels are not very helpful. To bring this back from biochemistry to food, let's look at butter and olive oil, two fats that tend to get very different press. Extra virgin olive oil, and I believe deservedly, tends to get good press most of the time. Butter, on the other hand, has its champions, but still gets a lot of bad press. And again, I believe a lot of it unfair. Although olive oils and butter will both vary depending on the olives or milk from which they were made, these tables illustrate a couple of key things. One, real foods are made up of a mixture of fatty acids. There is no such thing as butter fatty acid or olive oil fatty acid. These fats and oils are simply made up of a combination of fatty acids found in nature. The second point is that real food isn't consistent in terms of what it contains. Just look at the range for oleic acid. Any food labels are just an average or a ballpark figure. If you ate enough of a food and got it from various sources across various seasons, you'd probably end up with something like the same average as on the label, but otherwise expect there to be considerable variation. The third point is that real foods from very different sources may contain similar things. Again, oleic acid is a good example, as both olive oil and butter are rich sources, although olive oil does have quite a bit more than butter. When we simplify things too much, we tend to get a little too far away from reality. The key message is that whole foods and oils are not made up of just one class of fat, for example saturated, or one fatty acid, but many, and the exact proportions vary even in the same type of food. Yet despite all this variety in both our food and our body, only 2 fatty acids are considered essential to our survival. One is linoleic acid and the other is alpha-linolenic acid. In theory, and it is just in theory, if we get enough of these 2 fatty acids, our bodies use them to create all other types of lipids we need. We have the enzymes to do that. For example, alpha-linolenic acid can be used by our bodies to make the so-called fish oils, EPA and DHA, as illustrated on the right. In practice, though, it's better to get a broad variety of fats in the diet. For example, having flax oil, a rich source of alpha-linolenic acid, does not give the full benefits of having fish oil, because our bodies aren't that efficient at converting one fat into another.